Thank you for attending Policy Matters, conversations about state policy with the Press Herald. This program is made possible with the support of our sponsors.
Grow Smart Maine works to give Mainers choices in how to respond to growth and change. Our mission is to support communities in navigating change by convening diverse stakeholders through advocacy and by sharing resources, all in alignment with smart growth principles. Our goal is that current and future generations can choose to call Maine home while living a meaningful life grounded in well-being and economic opportunity. Visit us at growsmartmaine.org to find out more.
Bowdoin College is proud to sponsor this series of policy conversations on topics critical to our state. Founded in 1794 at the dawn of the American Republic, Bowdoin has always seen Maine as central to our identity and success. Our history and our future are inextricably linked to Maine, a future that can never be taken for granted. We would not be Bowdoin anywhere else. We would not want to be anywhere else. Maine is at the heart of this college.
And now we'll turn things over to Carol Coultas.
Thank you, Strawberry. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. As I had mentioned to our panelists, I think that affordable housing is having a moment. And it's having a moment because of a variety of issues that are happening right now, a lot of initiatives that are happening right now. So for instance, President Biden was the first president in decades who has talked about affordable housing, raising the visibility of that issue and noting that it's a crisis across the country. Here in Maine, Governor Mills has earmarked $50 million of pandemic recovery money for affordable housing. I talked to a lot of business people, and there has been sustained clamor from business owners and managers talking about the challenge of finding workforce housing for folks they're trying to hire and recruit for openings they have within their organizations. And then on top of all of that, there are at least a half a dozen bills right now before lawmakers in Augusta that have to deal with affordable housing. And if you have looked at real estate listings, or you have a kid in college who's looking for an apartment, or maybe you have an elderly member of your family who's looking to downsize into a more modest accommodations, your jaw has probably dropped at the cost of buying a home or renting a place. And so I am remembering when I first moved to Maine with my husband, we settled in Lewiston. We were both reporters for the Sun Journal, and we had a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment on the middle floor of one of the 3-story walk-ups that's everywhere in Maine. And we paid $350 a month for that, and it included utilities and heat. So just for yucks, I looked up that unit now, and it has tripled. What the rent now for that same place is about $1,300 a month. And I can assure you that the salaries for the reporting staff at the Sun Journal have not tripled along with the costs of housing. So we're at a place right now where roughly 20% of the people in Maine are paying more than half their income for housing. And I know we all grew up or know the old adage that you shouldn't pay more than a third of your income for housing costs, but that has just totally gone by the wayside in this environment. And that creates real barriers for people who want to rent or own their own homes. And so to talk about this issue, I've assembled a panel. I'm really excited about these folks. They are authorities on the issue of affordable housing. I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. But a word about our format. The panelists and I will have a conversation about affordable housing for not quite an hour. And then we will open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar and submit your question that way, not through the chat. Many of you submitted questions when you registered for this event, and so we have queued some of those up to address those during the Q&A section of our forum this evening. So without any further ado, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Dana Totman. He is the president and CEO of the nonprofit affordable housing provider Avesta Housing. Dana has been a passionate advocate for affordable housing for people in need for more than 3 decades. His 21 years at the helm of Avesta Housing has resulted in safe, quality, affordable homes for nearly 20,000 individuals. And prior to his work with Avesta, Dana held leadership roles at Maine State Housing Authority and Coastal Economic Development Corporation. He has a BA in public management from the University of Maine and an MBA from Southern New Hampshire University. He holds so many awards, we didn't have space on our bio page for them, but I will mention one he received in 2017, which is the Maine State Housing Authority Stephen Mower's Affordable Housing Lifetime Achievement Award. So we're delighted that he can join us this evening. Also joining us is Jeff Levine, an urban planner who has worked in New England for 25 years. If that name is familiar, it's because until 2019, he was the Director of Planning and Urban Development for the City of Portland. While with the city, he created a set of tools to increase the development of low-income and workforce housing, including establishing an inclusionary zoning program for residential and hospitality developments, creation of a sustainable local housing trust, and changing land use ordinances to allow affordable housing along selected parts of Portland's infill development plan. Currently, he is the owner and principal of Levine Planning Strategies, a small consulting firm that specializes in bridging the gap between the development community and city planners. He is also a faculty member of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the interim director of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. So welcome, Jeff. And also joining us is Amy Cullen. She is a partner and vice president of the Zanton Company, a Portland-based mixed-income housing developer. In her 16 years of development experience, Amy has worked on the creation of 533 new units in 10 apartment buildings across Maine and New Hampshire. And happily, there are 4 more properties with 250 units scheduled to come online in the next 2 years. In addition to her development work, Amy is the president of Saco Falls Management, an affiliate of the Zanton Company. She is the chair of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition and serves as the treasurer on the board of directors of Maine Real Estate Managers Association. She previously served on South Portland Planning Board, and she's an Army veteran of 12 years and holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in accounting from Husson University. So welcome, Amy. Welcome to all of the panelists. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to get the ball rolling with just we're going to start with a consensus that the rate of affordable housing production here in the state barely satisfies 1/4 of the demand. I believe in the last several years, we've averaged about 250 units per year, but the demand is closer to 1,000 units. So my question is, can you each summarize what top 2 policies you think have brought us to this situation? Because we weren't always in an affordable housing crisis. So what do you think were the 2 main reasons that we have found ourselves here from a policy perspective? And Dana, I'm going to toss that question to you first.
Great. Thanks, Carol, and thanks for doing this. Clearly, there's a whole lot more than 2 policies that have led to this crisis. And I don't want anybody to think that a couple of policy changes will fix it. But the 2 that I'm going to mention, one is a federal policy, and that's a policy that changed in the early 1980s. And up until that point, the federal government was actively investing in affordable housing through HUD and making appropriations to HUD and rural development and other federal entities. And that money was eventually coming to states and eventually creating the creation of affordable housing. And so during the 70s, we were creating housing at about 1,100 units per year. We created 11,000 units here in Maine during the 70s. And when a shift occurred and a policy change occurred in the early 80s, such that now housing was going to be created through tax policy, using tax credits. And that ultimately led to only about 300 units being created every year. And those units were serving people only half as poor as who was being served in the 70s. So that change from appropriations going to HUD and other parts of government to doing affordable housing through the tax system, I think was the biggest policy change. And as a practical matter, if it hadn't changed, we'd stayed on that pace, we'd have 25,000 more units today. And we just so happen to have 25,000 people waiting on the Section 8 waiting list. So that's the biggest policy that I'll point to. The second one, and it's not the policy, but it's sort of part of the policy, and that's deinstitutionalization. When we closed a number of institutions, including nursing homes, including AmHigh and Pineland and BAMHigh, back in the late 80s, it was absolutely the right thing to do. I don't think anybody argues with that. But we really didn't create the appropriate housing and living options, and we didn't adequately combine the necessary services with the housing as we closed down those facilities. And so I think we're still paying the price for that today. And again, it was the right policy, but it was kind of the inadequate implementation to create something to substitute for that policy for the institutions that were closing.
So if I heard you correctly, before the tax policy changed, we were making about 1,100 units of affordable housing a year. And then after that, it went down to 300 units.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty significant drop, I'd say. Yes. Thank you. Amy, what do you see? What are the two top policies you see contributing to the situation we're in right now?
I guess I would just, echo what Dana said in terms of kind of the early policy. Any policy that's implemented, you don't really see the effects for several years. So this is, this was, I'm trying to do math now, 40 years ago. Seems like 15 years ago, but it's just accumulated every year. And if we had addressed it earlier, we wouldn't be in the crunch that we're in now. During your remarks, you said, affordable housing is having a moment. For those of us in the affordable housing community, we've been waving and screaming, for decades, hoping, working to have this moment. So I'm just glad everybody now is recognizing that it's a problem and we can maybe make some policy changes moving forward.
Great, thank you. And how about you, Jeff? What do you point to having the greatest impact on how we're in this situation now?
So I'm in the beneficial position of being able to start with the ones that have already been mentioned, because I would say those are all part of the challenge. Two that I would add to that list. One is not so much a policy, but sort of, as Dana said, with the institutionalization, how it's been implemented. And I would say that's local land use policy. A lot of local land use policy comes from a good place. It comes from the place that's based to protect the environment and to help preserve what we love about our communities. But, in the last 20 to 40 years, I think that local land use controls and zoning have really taken on another life of their own. And it's been a life of trying to preserve, the things that are exactly the way they were at that point in time when the opinion leaders bought their properties or moved into the community. And communities have to grow and change if the population is going to grow and change. So I think that's not so much a bad policy per se, but one that I think has been used in ways that go beyond its original purpose. And perhaps we should take another look at that. The second policy, it's a bunch of policies, and it has to do with the wealth and income gap in this country. You mentioned earlier how, wages used to be lower, but not as much lower as prices were. There was wages in the 60s and 50s of the average worker were much closer to those of the top 1 or 2%. And that wealth gap has really expanded through a number of policies, mostly at the federal level, and sometimes through lack of policy. So I think that there really needs to be a good look at how we can increase wages in order to make housing more affordable for people. Let's pay people more. And that's a big part of the discussion that doesn't always get a lot of attention. And it's really amazing to me that the minimum wage hasn't kept pace with the cost of living over the last 30 years, but it's just objectively true.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that because construction costs are so high right now that's exacerbating that situation? It isn't just that wages haven't kept pace, it's also the construction costs are skyrocketing, and that is adding to the compressed supply.
I think that's definitely part of the equation. That's not necessarily driven by any particular policy,
right?
But clearly the cost of construction has exceeded other indexes, and there's a number of reasons for that. You were mentioning before we went on the air about how a lot of construction workers have moved out of state over time, and once they settle down somewhere else, they don't come back. And I think that's a problem in Maine. But construction costs are high even in those places they move to. So there's something going on in the construction industry. I hope it's temporary. And I wish that at least that meant that the construction workers were making more money. I think to some extent they are, but not as much as the cost has gone up.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, let's get to those bills that are before the lawmakers in Augusta right now. So there are several bills, and we have some links on our resource page if people are curious about what they are and the details within them. So I'm just going to quickly mention that these all have the potential to dramatically affect affordable housing policies. The one that's been capturing most attention is Speaker Fecto's LD 2003, and that establishes density and zoning regulations to enhance affordable housing development, and it provides money and technical assistance for municipalities to implement those policies. But in addition to LD 2003 is LD 1673 and 1961, which changed the state's growth management law to focus more on equity and support for service center communities, so like places like Portland and Lewiston. And then LD 1694 establishes a state authority to assist in redeveloping blighted and abandoned properties. And there are more, but those I think are the ones that really I think are drawing the most attention. So from your perspective, what is the significance of this attention in Augusta? And from a policy perspective, do you think these measures are like just beginning to address the issue of affordable housing in the state? Are they going far enough? I'm just curious how you see the possible impact from them. And Jeff, I'm going to throw that question to you first.
Sure. I think one of the challenges in the way that affordable housing finance has been implemented since probably 1980 is creating a system where you have to have a fairly sizable institution and a fairly sizable project to generally be able to produce affordable housing. You have to have the ability to tap into things like low-income housing tax credits or home funds. And one of the pieces that's missing there is how are we able to produce housing on a much more granular level? And I think there's a lot of different pieces to that, but one of them is, again, the idea that if you own a piece of property in most communities in Maine and it's residentially zoned, you can probably only put one house on it or one unit. Even if you keep within the same footprint of that unit, you can't put a second unit in that house. So if you want to split your single family home into two homes so that your mother or your parents or your kids can stay with you, you often can't do that. So I think that these bills are a really important step to trying to modernize state land use law and regulation. I don't think that any effort is ever perfect, and I don't really know whether this is enough, but I'm really glad to see both the regulatory side seeing attention in LD 2003, but also the big picture planning side in terms of the State Growth Management Act and how communities do their long range planning. through LD 1673 and 1961. And then finally, I think the idea of creating more incentives and ability to redevelop blighted properties is a really great piece of the puzzle. Communities can do that to some extent now, but from what I've seen about 1694, it really helps create a statewide framework for taking some of these old buildings that you drive by every day and say, why, if we have a housing shortage, why is that triple decker abandoned? And I think this bill will help try to get those places back into service. So I'm really excited about all four of them, excuse me. And I think it's a good time to be taking a look at the types of laws that were put in place 30 or 40 years ago at a different moment in Maine's history.
Are there any aspects of the bills that are being considered right now that you think are especially important? Like we all know that the legislative process, you start with a bill in one form, and then you may or may the final version may bear some resemblance to the original, but sometimes it doesn't. So, are you really hoping that there's an element like the ADUs or something that you hope really survives the legislative process and in fact becomes new law?
Sure. Starting with the idea in my mind that the housing challenge in Maine is really an economic development challenge for the state. If we want the state to be able to grow and thrive and house both the people who live year round and seasonal workers, the state has to do something. So there's a statewide policy there that I think needs to be addressed. But I think it also is important for individual communities to have some leeway as to how to meet that goal. And they need assistance to meet that goal. Not every community has the technical skills or the ability to know what to do even. So I think those are the two big pieces of these bills that I think are really important to me, which is one, to set a clear statewide policy about housing, and then to give communities the tools they need to have some discretion as to how to meet that policy. And I think LD 2003 does a lot of that. I think 1673 does some of that. And I think to some extent also the Land Bank bill does that.
Great, thank you.
Carol,
Amy, what do you see? What do you think is the significance of this kind of critical mass of affordable housing bills that are before the lawmakers in Augusta now?
It highlights that it's on everybody's mind. Going back from my point of view as a developer, I'm most excited about the density bonus for affordable housing.
Okay.
Two of the biggest hurdles that we have to delivering affordable housing is to find a site and to get financing, with the site being the harder piece. And having density is what makes affordable housing affordable to build, because you can amortize more units over the same land mass. So that's what we're excited about 2003 is the density. But as a homeowner and living in Maine, I think the portion of 2003 that's also really important is the ADU by right. I think that really will help keep people in their homes when they're on a fixed income. They can have an ADU for additional income and help the housing crisis in Maine. I think that's a win-win and means people are in control of their own property. So that's what I would say.
And I shouldn't have used the acronym without explaining what an ADU is. So would you mind doing that for me, please?
Accessory dwelling unit.
And how does 2003 make it more make it possible to have an ADU on your property?
So I think probably Jeff can talk more intelligently about this as a former planner, but right now in almost every municipality, if you live in a single family zoned area and you're in a single family zone, you have to go through the permitting process and ask permission to build an accessory dwelling unit, what some people might call a mother-in-law unit. And with the ADU by right, you can go to design and you don't need an exception in order to have one permitted.
Thank you for explaining that. It was funny when I first moved here, I would drive down some of the rural roads in my neck of the woods, and I would see these beautiful old like sea captain's homes, And out in the corner, there would be a trailer. And that's where grandma and grandpa lived. And so I see ADUs as sort of, there's been a long history, I think, of ADUs in the state of Maine. So it's interesting that it's coming back in this format. So Dana, what do you think is the significance of that whole critical mass of affordable housing legislation that's wending its way through Augusta right now?
I think it's great. I think that there's long overdue attention to something that really needs to be addressed. And it's really, there's a lot of legislators that are interested, involved, and I think the attention's great. But as you indicated, when you sort of preface this subject, you said the legislative process kind of has a winding way, and sometimes what starts out in the process and what comes out is quite different. And for instance, Jeff and I both served on the zoning commission that led to the 2003 proposed legislation with Speaker Fecteau. And a couple of observations from that experience. In all of our meetings, hours and hours and hours of meetings, never once did anybody among us or the public testimony suggest they like things the way they are. So, nobody said we got to hold on to our existing housing fabric and keep it just like this. We like the way our municipalities' housing is all set up. Nobody suggested that. So there was widespread agreement that we needed changes. The other observation was that our recommendations, I think we had 10 of them, and only about half are still part of the consideration, I think. But most of all the recommendations had bipartisan support. Our commission had equal number of Democrats and Republicans on it. We had municipal officials, and there was broad-based support for every one of our recommendations. And so that was really quite exciting that the idea of having ADUs had the support of municipal representative and both parties. And so that was encouraging. So I really think that, the ADU seems like kind of an easy one, that, allowing a unit over your garage or a unit in your basement, assuming it's safe and you're not creating environmental issues was kind of an easy one. The attention on better planning in communities and providing technical assistance communities all seem to have broad-based support. So it was really quite encouraging. But nevertheless, once we get into a legislative process, a lot of other things enter the discussion, and we're not quite sure what's going to come out. But ultimately, we're trying to create more living units in the state of Maine because we don't have enough.
And are there any elements that you're really rooting for that you hope cross the finish line?
I would say the accessory dwelling unit one is probably the one that would has most significant immediate production increases. And certainly units of that size would tend to serve either a recent college graduated son or daughter who's maybe stuck in the basement or living with too many roommates, or a mother or father or in-law that can live there. Households that tend to be modest income, clearly an ADU, which is probably going to be 400, 500, 600 feet, isn't going to attract a high income person. So assuming we use them properly in their long-term housing, which was the intent of the bill. So I think that's most important because, one, I think it will serve a most modest income, a group with the most modest incomes.
Cool, thank you. So I know that sometimes we can get really insular, trying to grapple with problems that are being dealt with in other places. So I'm wondering, either within the state of Maine or outside of it, where are you seeing innovation around affordable housing? Are there states or communities you're watching that have had some success in adopting policies that make a real difference in affordable housing opportunities. I think that there's an opportunity for us to learn from others, and I wonder what innovation you're seeing in these parts. And so, Amy, it's your turn to lead off now.
I would say in terms of innovation, something we haven't really been able to take advantage of here in Maine yet at a large scale is panelization, kind of full panel construction to save money. We haven't really seen that a lot in Maine, but it's happening all over the country. But I would say in terms of communities in Maine that have done, some innovative things to help build affordable housing. Jeff Levine at the city of Portland with the housing trust, establishing the housing trust fund. They instituted, a TIF, tax increment financing policy for affordable housing. It's kind of the way they manage their home funds distributions. There's a procedure, an RFP, and they're really encouraging affordable housing developers, giving density boosts on those corridors. So they've really paid attention. And I think, we could really, if other towns and communities really paid attention and gave some thought and to those kinds of ideas, it would really help.
Okay. What is panelization?
So most of the time in Maine, when we build an apartment building, guys or girls are out there with, wood and hammers, and they're building in all of the elements, and they kind of stick build from the ground up. Panelization basically is they do most of the fabrication in a controlled environment, like a warehouse, where they build walls and full panels, even with insulation, windows, everything included in a wall. And then they ship the wall and place the wall where it goes. So that's the difference.
And that makes for, it's more economical to build a house that way than to do a stick build from the ground?
It is in many parts of the country.
Okay.
We don't see that it is here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hadn't heard of that, so thank you. Jeff, where do you see innovation?
Sure. And I want to preface this with saying that I think I would have had a much broader answer a few years ago, but I think things like instituting a state low-income housing tax credit, which the legislature and the governor did last year, is one of those things I would definitely have highlighted a few years ago. And it's great to see that happen in Maine. Some of the stuff that's under discussion this year, again, brings some of these best practices to Maine. But things I haven't seen as much of that I'd like to is a little more attention to cooperatives and co-housing as a way of providing another housing option for people. There's a little bit of that work going on on the ground. There's definitely people who are interested in it. There's some projects in Portland that are looking at these options. And I'd love to see more effort to look at these options statewide and perhaps create some statewide rules of engagement, because I think one of the challenges, as I understand it, is there may need to be some clarifications statewide as to things like ownership percentages and how that works. But I'm not an expert in that area. Those are two things that I would like to see more of in the state. And then again, I would have mentioned tiny houses a couple of years ago. That's starting to catch on. But I think there's more room for that, especially if something like this ADU state law passes.
And didn't you tell me that, was it Vermont? There's another state that's considering providing bridge financing for first-time home buyers who can't quite handle the construction costs of a new. Yeah, can you talk about that a little?
So there's a bill. I don't know whether it's passed the Vermont legislature. I know it's under consideration, that essentially would provide state support so that you could bridge the gap between the current construction costs of a home, which are pretty high, and the actual value of that home once it's built.
Right. That's
part
what
of the
it
reason
was.
why housing production doesn't always happen is you expect to at least break even when you build a house. It costs more to build the house than you can sell it for. You're not going to build it, most likely. And I thought that was an interesting program to say, if the cost of building this house is more than the value once it's done, the state will help close that gap and help produce more housing that way. So I'm keeping track of that one a little bit. I haven't seen lately where it's gone, but I thought it was a really innovative policy.
Interesting. And Dana, what are you seeing in the world of innovation?
A few things. The state of Vermont is very actively at scale converting underutilized hotels to housing by adding kitchens and opening up rooms. And so they're really making much better use, I would say, of probably underutilized hotels and motels. And the reason I think that's particularly important is you can do it quickly. The housing that Amy's organization, our organization create takes a long time to build and to get the financing and to get this stuff done. And so I think what Vermont is doing is quite creative, and I think we want to take a little closer look at that here. I also sort of applaud what the state of Minnesota has done for a long time in providing great housing and new housing and accommodating housing for immigrant populations. And they early on became sort of a destination for folks coming from other countries. And I think we're doing our very best in that area, but I think Minnesota has kind of led the way. And then the other thing I would observe is many states, Oregon and Washington come to mind, are spending large amounts of their Recovery Act monies on affordable housing. Maine is dedicating a good amount as well. Those states are really sort of going all in because they have huge homeless problems in those particular states, or those states particularly. And so they're really trying to address that. And then here in Maine, I would sort of do a little bit of a shout out to the city of Auburn. The city of Auburn has very consciously, and Mayor Levesque sort of leading the way as a cheerleader for housing. They say we want 2,000 or 4,000 or whatever the number is. I can't quite remember, but they say it out loud. They say it all the time that we want more housing, we want more affordable housing, and we'll do anything necessary to create it. That sort of public campaign and these being successful in having that housing developed there, I think is particularly effective, and it's kind of innovative. And I think they're the first ones that have been as sort of aggressive in their statements around affordable housing.
And so so what's the action that follows that? Are they making money available to developers to provide incentives for affordable housing, or are they offering financing, or what's specific about that?
I think they are particularly welcoming to developers and affordable housing developers in particular, that they're willing to provide tax increment financing assistance to developers. They're willing to try to redirect public land or buildings to housing. They are going to be creative in providing zoning that will enable more housing. So I think those are the things that they're doing. They're also very conscious, as I see a commenter making here, that they also have some farmland that they want to protect. So it's not, the Wild West going on in Auburn, that they understand the value of their rural areas as well. So I think just the discussion that's going on there is particularly healthy.
Interesting. And I'm just curious because, as I mentioned, I spent a fair number of years in Lewiston, Auburn as a Sun Journal reporter right around the time that the first immigrant populations began to establish themselves there. And part of the reason is that LA had a pretty good source of affordable housing. So how did Minnesota, and what did they do that was specific to address affordable housing for immigrant populations? Did they have a lot of old housing stock like LA did, and were able to create that housing out of what was already available?
I think it was more creating new housing.
Okay.
I think they started the new housing that was being created. They were targeting to this population in particular and in their areas. and very, very quickly, the immigrant population became engaged and involved, and they were, decades ago finding city councilors, that were coming from the immigrant population. So the whole engagement and the welcoming and the connection between officials there in working with the new arrivals was particularly healthy. So it was mostly new housing, I think, that was being created because it was, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, there were high rises and giant buildings and everything, but very much, I think, trying to serve this population.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So Governor Mills has earmarked $50 million of pandemic assistance from the federal government to address affordable housing. How would you like to see that money spent? How do you think it could be most efficiently and effectively used to address the situation here in Maine? And Dana, since you're already on my screen in the big format, I'll throw that question to you.
I think the most important area to focus on is production. That taking that amount of money and combining it with tax credits, and there are two types of tax credits that are available in Maine, and one type is plentiful. We call them 4% tax credits, but there's ample amount of those tax credits, and as well as debt resources that we have plenty of here in the state, private activity bond resources that not every state has those resources available like Maine does. So I think combining the new money with other resources, particularly these tax credits, with a singular focus of creating new units. I think we, oftentimes we'll say, well, geez, we need to fix some stuff here and we got to do something there. At the end of the day, we keep coming back to this issue. We have a supply problem. And, the only way we're going to deal with the supply problem is by adding more housing. And so that's what I think it should be used on, is to create. Unfortunately, it takes 2-3 years, to get your financing together and to get your approvals and to build it. But you got to start sometime. And I think this money is the perfect money to focus in that area.
So the resources that you say were already existing, like the tax credits and the debt resources, those haven't been sufficient to provide incentives for affordable housing?
Not by themselves, because they basically are enough to pay for about half the development, or 2/3. And so there's this big gap that we need another layer of financing to fulfill that, and this money can do just that. So all of our affordable housing developments have this crazy complex layering of 4 or 5 layers of money, and some of the layers are quite plentiful, such as bond loans, as well as these 4% tax credits. That's not true in every state. Some states, the private activity bonds are used up, and each state gets a certain amount. Maine has plenty. We haven't been using it, and so I think we have that resource. So it's really getting that last layer of financing, and it's a big layer. It's probably 40-50% of the cost of the housing, or 40%. That's why we need it. So it makes a whole lot of developments feasible that weren't feasible before.
Interesting, thank you. How about you, Jeff? How would you like to see that $50 million spent?
I think in large part, I'd agree with Dana that using it to leverage and produce more units is an important part of how it could be useful. The only thing that I would add to that is I would love to see there be additional housing development capacity in the state. A lot of states have local place-based housing developers like community development corporations. And, I think that used to be something that happened more in Maine. I'd like to see more place-based organizations that focus on a particular community and on building their housing stock, working with local residents. So if some portion of this funding or other funding could go to help build that capacity, that would be great. Having said that, a community-based organization can't happen from above. It would have to happen from below. So there have to be an interest in a community to do something like this. And then this could help provide seed funding to get these organizations off the ground.
Interesting. Do you see a lot of grassroots interest in this right now?
I hear from a lot of people who are generally younger, mostly under 30 or 35, that are very concerned with the way the state, and not the state as an entity, but the state in the big sense, deals with the housing issue, and the fact that if they want to stay, they may not be able to, or they may have to make compromises in their lifestyle to remain in Maine. And I hate to see that, and I honestly think many communities, many municipalities are a little out of touch with that, because that age group doesn't tend to be that involved in local politics. And I worry a lot about that. I worry about there being a bit of a disconnect in many communities between community leaders who tend to be a little older and the folk who really want to settle down roots here, but who are at a point in their life where they have the option of moving somewhere else. And I'd hate to see that happen. I think that it's really important for the state to retain folks and have them settle down for the long run right now before they make the decision to leave.
Right, because it's really hard to get them back once they do.
You get some of them back. People
Yes.
get that homing beacon, but once they've left, you don't get them all back.
Right.
And it's a drain of human capital, and over time, when they get more wealth, it's a drain of capital which can invest in local institutions too.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. And Amy, how about from your perspective? What would you do?
Yeah, I agree with Dana. New production. I think immediately with the kind of spike in construction costs that we've seen in the past year or 2 years, we have a lot of almost basically shovel-ready projects right now that are experiencing budget overruns where we can't close that gap all of a sudden because of the 20 to 40% increase in construction costs. So I would like to see that money injected into projects that are ready to go right now, and then kind of get into the cycle of the next projects coming up.
Mm-hmm. And when you and I were chatting beforehand, you had mentioned the possibility of raising the cap for the low-income housing credit. Is it 5 million now? And that was what it was set at.
Oh, that's for the
that's the
state historic tax credit.
I'm getting my tax credits mixed up.
That's okay. So, that's one, but that's a one very important layer of the wedding cake of financing for affordable housing is the state historic tax credit. When it was enacted, it has a $5 million per project per year cap. And with construction costs now, almost all the historic projects we're looking at will exceed that cap, which means a loss in funding.
And what would be a more suitable cap, do you think?
7.5 million instead of 10 million.
Okay, cool.
And it was established in 2008 with no increases. So it's been 14 years. I think it's time for a relook at that cap.
Yep. And do any of you have a comment on your co-panelists' priorities here for the 50 million, how you would spend it?
I'd comment on Amy's. I never heard this wedding cake layer analogy before, and it always seems like a very painful, ugly process of putting all these layers together. And the idea of looking at it as a wedding cake is just most refreshing. And so that's my takeaway. I'm all in even more now.
And do any of you advocate returning to where we were before the changes in the 1970s, with the federal government having a stronger role in creating new housing?
I certainly do. I think the primary production tool that the federal government is using is the housing tax credit, and that's administered by the Treasury Department, Internal Revenue Service. And HUD, the primary resource that's being increased or used over there are housing vouchers. And to just keep, and vouchers are important, they're critically important, but there are an awful lot of people that have vouchers that can't find a place to rent because there aren't enough. So we're sort of having vouchers going unused. So I think if our government could do a little bit better job of pairing the tax credits with vouchers so that our production was really serving a very low income group, that would really, be a great achievement. So I think the government should focus more on production. And if we are stuck with this tax credit method of doing it, which is clumsy and inefficient, but if we're going to do it, at least we can combine some rent subsidies so that we can serve poorer people, and it makes the projects much more feasible.
And it goes back to your earlier point about production being the key. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
I would just add that I think a lot of that federal disinvestment in public housing is part of how public housing got a reputation for not being a great place to live. And I think if the federal government would return to investing in properly maintaining public housing, I think Maine has some great public housing authorities that do a really good job and would really benefit from more resources. And unfortunately, because of the incentives that are in place right now, a lot of them are sort of moving away from traditional public housing to sort of these new models, because that's where the federal money is. I hear a lot of complaints about the low-income housing tax credit as being inefficient or somehow being a giveaway to Wall Street. I think it is inefficient. I think it's the tool that we have, that the federal government has given to states and localities to use. I'm not sure I agree that it's a giveaway to Wall Street, but I do agree that it's inefficient. And I wish the federal government would get back to the idea that providing, what's called social housing in Europe for the young, for the old, for families is just part of what they should be doing. And I don't feel the federal government's felt that way consistently over the last 30 or 40 years.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, here's the last question from me, and then we'll head to the audience questions, of which we have many, many. But I wanted to give you the opportunity. If you had a magic wand and you could implement one policy change that would improve access to affordable housing, what would it be? And Jeff, you're on my screen in the big section, so you get to go first.
Sure, one magic wand and one policy change, huh? That's it? That's all I get?
Yep.
I think that it would be really helpful for there to be a clear state and national policy about housing, and for local and regional governments to then be charged with how to implement it locally. And I don't think that's taking away local control. I think this is a state and national challenge, and we can give communities discretion as to how to meet it. But I think we'll really regret it if we don't rise to the occasion right now. And say we need to be able to house people we want to have in the state, and we want to be able to remain in the state. And we can all talk about how to do that, but we need to do it. We need to stop talking and actually do it.
And are you seeing political leadership around that idea?
Certainly some folks. I'm seeing a lot of fear on local government's parts about what that means. And I don't think it's nearly as intimidating as it's seen as. I don't think that you should be able to take away all ability to control things like making sure that wells and septic systems are safe, making sure that safe environmental areas aren't protected. But to say you can take a building that's a certain size based on zoning and you can do 1 unit in it or 2 or 3, I think that's really important. And I don't agree with those who say it contributes to sprawl. I think it helps produce a more sustainable future for the state.
Okay. Thank you. Amy, how about you? If you had a magic wand, what policy change would you enact?
Assuming we have the production, I think the one magic wand policy would be vouchers for all who qualify.
Oh, okay. And how would you like to see that implemented? Would that be a federal program or a state program or a municipal program? How do you see, in your mind, how do you see that working?
I mean, I would say funded by the federal government and implemented by the state government.
Okay. Okay. And Dana, how about you? What's your magic wand policy change?
it would be to try to get rid of all these layers we've been talking about and put them all in one place. You know, we have HUD, we have tax credit investors, we've got the state officials. So every one of some, I guess my policy change would be, let's do a better job of getting these resources all in kind of one place under one roof and working with one set of regulations. As it is now, a person looking for affordable housing has to go to every 100 places and get on every wait list all over the place. And we have monitors and auditors coming from, we spend here, $600,000-700,000 a year on audits alone. And so it's just all the folks that we're trying to satisfy, the regulators. I think it's kind of got out of control. So I guess my policy change would be, if the one side of the federal government, if HUD could trust IRS, if IRS could trust HUD, or they could all, trust their local state housing officials, somehow to just simplify these layers and layers of regulations. And it's not just our industry, obviously the medical industry and, healthcare and everybody else is complaining that all they do is fill out paperwork all day long, but it really gets in the way for us trying to effectively serve people in need. And so I think any way that we could streamline sort of the regulatory stuff here would be a great achievement.
I think that that would be a magic wand policy change that could be applied in multiple arenas. Yeah. Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you. I was going to take the first question that actually this was one that was submitted with someone who registered, because I noticed there have been a couple of comments in the chat about it at all, and it's about the ADU. And let me find that question here. Okay, so why would a relaxation of controls on accessory dwelling units lead to affordable housing, say in coastal areas, rather than becoming Airbnb units? And even where such is prohibited, how would that be effectively enforced? So I think that there were some concerns or some questions around the element in LD 2003 that makes it easier for ADU units to be created, that instead of helping solve an affordable housing crisis, it just becomes a rotating Airbnb unit, which isn't doing much except for helping the income of the person who's managing the Airbnb. So, Jeff, I'm going to ask you to answer that question first, because you were talking about ADUs earlier.
Sure. And I'd start off by saying I think there are a lot of challenges that short-term rentals create, not just for accessory dwelling units, but for housing in general in popular locations. Certainly, a lot of the condominiums being built in Portland are being used as short-term rentals. And there's one thing I would say about that is that local governments have the ability to regulate short-term rentals. And many have put in place a system where there's a registration fee, an inspection program, and the number of units is potentially limited. One of the best practices I've seen, honestly, is that if an owner is on site, they can rent an accessory unit as a short-term rental to help make their payments, but they can't enter a commercial business buying up a bunch of buildings and running it essentially as a full-time business. But whatever the policy is, I think that's something that local governments have the leeway to do right now. And I think the ones that are concerned about it should do so. The one caveat I'd say is that we all love to beat up on short-term rentals, but we also hear about people who maybe use that rental payment to help make their mortgage payments or help, remain in their home after they retire. So it's a little more nuanced than short-term rentals are always bad. I think that there is a role that's appropriate for local governments to enter regulating them, potentially the state government as well. But I'd caution that it's not all bad, and that we should be careful to not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So in your role as a planner, do most municipalities have their own regulations around short-term rentals?
I would say most of the larger municipalities nationwide do, and that means, Portland or larger, but there's nothing that keeps smaller communities from doing so. There are some that do. I think Cape Elizabeth has regulations. I believe York might. I'm not sure about that, but there's nothing to keep them from setting up a system. And if cost is a concern, as I said, you're allowed to have a registration fee that helps pay for the staff to manage a program, which is exactly what Portland does.
Right. Anyone else, Dana or Amy, do you want to take a stab at that question? The ADUs and, falling prey to becoming Airbnbs.
I think it's an important thing to watch out for. That was clearly not the intent. I think Jeff mentioned it very well that municipalities can and should regulate ADUs so that they don't become that. And I also agree with Jeff, not all ADUs are the same. Seasonal cottages, ski condominiums, or a bedroom than somebody's home that's the owner occupies. That's a different type of Airbnb. I was looking online over the weekend and in the Bath Brunswick area and saw house after house after house that were ordinary houses. Some of them were the former Brunswick Naval Air Station ranches and single homes. And I just couldn't help but say to myself, that should be a first-time home buyer that's buying that. And so much of our housing stock has been taken offline. That's we keep talking about production here. I think at the rate we're going and what we're producing, we're probably losing an equal amount to Airbnbs. And so I think there is legislation, I think it was mentioned here in the comments, that will examine Airbnbs going forward at the state level. And our zoning commission talked about it. We kind of ran out of time and thought that's a big issue that needs singular focus. And I agree with that. And it appears as though there may be some legislation that will do just that. But it's a huge I think it's really messing with our housing inventory. And, municipalities can regulate them, and I hope they do.
Thank you. Strawberry, do you want to queue up one of the questions in our Q&A queue?
Sure. We've got a question from Bob. What effect has crowd-funded real estate investing platforms like Fundraise and CrowdStreet had in housing affordability?
I've seen none of that in affordable housing development in Maine. Maybe you have, Dana.
So have you seen it elsewhere, Amy? Like, is it a different kind of housing where crowdfunding platforms are becoming popular?
Not that I've seen, no.
Okay. So we're going to say not applicable, at least right now. How about another question, Strawberry?
Sure. Could Maine amend securities laws to allow for the creation of funds where individuals could invest in the creation of housing in their own communities?
I don't know that there's anything preventing people from creating housing now. Do you know what they're referring to, Dana?
I'm certainly not familiar with securities laws, and so I'm not quite sure what would be amended. I think there are community loan funds that people can invest in, like Genesis has a wonderful community loan fund that individuals can invest in, and I'm not sure what securities laws would be preventing investments in that, but I think we have sort of a semblance of what works, and maybe there could be some securities law tweaks that would make that better, but I'm just not familiar with those types of laws.
Let me queue up this question that came from a registrant. So what is being done in state policy to ensure that while we ramp up housing, we're staying on track with climate action? And Jeff, I think you mentioned that earlier. So how do you see those two issues Are they at loggerheads, or are they in conjunction with each other? What do you think about ramping up housing production, but advancing climate change goals?
So I've been involved with looking at efforts related to the Portsmouth Naval Air Station, and also working in Bath with Bath Iron Works folks in terms of how far people have to drive right now to work in those locations. That, you know, people are driving an hour and a half. You know, we looked for the Urban Land Institute. We looked at the Portsmouth Naval Air Station, and we saw people driving, you know, pretty far to get to work. And in my mind, the more that we can allow for housing options for people that they can afford that are closer to work, that generally has climate benefits. Similarly, I would suggest that allowing a building that meets all the setback and lot requirements and is safe from an environmental perspective to have 1 or 2 or 3 units in it also reduces auto travel, because it means that maybe an extended family can live together. So they're not all driving all over the state to see each other when they don't want to, or they want to be near each other. So I think there's some challenges related to housing production. I don't see increasing the number of units as the challenge, as much as looking at setbacks, looking at site location, looking at lot size, and paying careful attention to the environment through things like shoreline zoning, which is actually a state policy the local governments have to follow. So in my mind, that's a similar model for housing.
And how about you, Amy or Dana? Would you like to answer that question as well? The confluence of climate change and these, you know, ramping up housing production.
I mean, I think it's definitely something, you know, affordable housing developers in Maine have been looking at for a long time. You know, during Governor Baldacci's time, Maine Housing had a green building standard before, you know, it was implemented almost anywhere. And now, you know, they're providing incentives to do passive house. So I think, you know, from the affordable housing developer community, this is something that we're interested in and have been doing and want to do. You know, doing solar panels, solar panel ready, all of that stuff. So that is something that that we care about as well.
I would agree with Amy that we are hyper focused on the energy efficiency of all the housing we build, whether it's passive house or LEED certified. I think all of the major developers here in the state are focused on that. I think looking at the question another way, Maine, unfortunately, because we haven't produced that much housing, we have some of the oldest housing stock on average in the country. And if we have old housing stock, that means our housing is probably a little bit more aligned to where our people were living 30 years ago or 40 years ago than where they're living today. And so as a county like Aroostook County, you know, loses 20% of its population over a few decades, and York and Cumberland County are growing, it's just natural that we're going to have to be producing housing closer to where the people are. That's not to say there aren't still needs in Aroostook County, and certainly seniors need housing everywhere in the state. The homes need to be repaired everywhere, but I think our production efforts just fundamentally need to be closer to where the people are, and that just seems like an environmentally responsible thing to do.
Thank you. Strawberry, how about another question?
Any thoughts on regional solutions or Maine's relationship to our neighbors' policies? This is not unique to Maine, and of course we're seeing a lot of out-of-state folks moving here, partly due to the high costs of where they are.
What would be a regional approach to something like that? I ask the panelists.
I've seen some good work coming out of regional planning agencies and councils of government, like Greater Portland Council of Government, to talk about these issues regionally and to think about housing as sort of a system, not just municipality by municipality. So I'm really hopeful for that. I haven't seen as much interstate discussion, which I think is part of what the question is talking about, but certainly looking at Northern New England or New England as a system makes sense. I'm not sure there's a lot of that has happened yet, but I have seen it sort of on the sub-state regional level. And I think it's really promising, trying to address things like homelessness, like the migrant populations that are coming into the Portland region, and having a discussion about housing as something that really, crosses municipal boundaries. So there's some work happening there. There could be more to happen. And I'd love to see that.
We're working on a senior development in Freiburg, and are also hopefully going to do a senior development in Conway as a subsequent phase of a development we're doing over there. And so AARP has sort of brought, the communities from both sides of the state line together, saying, our seniors have similar interests and similar needs, and can we work collectively? And so I think it's, we sometimes forget that the needs are the same on both sides of the state border. So we're doing some kind of interesting things there. But I think that another thing regionally that is really more sort of a secret area that helps is the Federal Home Loan Bank. The Federal Home Loan Bank is a New England-based bank that provides grants and loans to nonprofits that helps many of our affordable housing developments. And so they make their decisions and run their programs New England-wide. And so the same people are at the table representing Vermont and Connecticut and Rhode Island, along with Maine, to figure out how best to deploy those. And so they really are looking at it on a regional basis.
One of the questions that was submitted in advance was, what advice can you give to communities wanting to invest in affordable housing trusts, which is different than some of the suggestions that have been discussed already. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to begin that conversation, or to begin that answer, because of your experience doing that in Portland. So what advice would you have for other communities? How do they do it, and what can it be used for?
Sure. So just to explain briefly, a housing trust is almost like a special fund that's created usually at a municipal level, and it's a separate account from your general fund, and it survives from fiscal year to fiscal year. So it's kind of like an enterprise fund for housing production. And I think the first thing that I'd advise any community is to pass a local ordinance to create one, even if it has $0 in it. Because once you have that vessel, you never know when you may find opportunities to put funding into that vessel to help produce housing. And it's not going to necessarily produce it by itself, but as part of this wedding cake, that one layer can help, if nothing else, other funding sources go further, and sometimes help align the housing production that might happen in the absence of it match more with what you want to see locally. So for example, if your community gets a potential project that would be funded through tax credits that is going to have smaller units in it, and you'd like to see larger units, if you have a housing trust that has some ability to help fund a project, you have some influence over what the project might look like. So I see it as a way of helping leverage other sources. And then the hard part is how do you fund it?
Right.
And communities use a lot of different sources to fund these mechanisms. One is that at some communities, at the end of the fiscal year, will put a percentage of their unencumbered fund balance into the housing trust. So they budget a certain amount of money for a year. If they don't spend it all, at the end of the year, cities and towns are faced with the question of what to do with that leftover balance. And I always think it's good policy to put some portion of it into a housing trust, maybe not all of it. Other ways that communities will fund a housing trust is through sales of tax acquired properties or surplus land that a city or town may have that they may sell for development. Maybe they acquire a home that's not appropriate to convert in and of itself to affordable housing, but if they sell it at market rate and put the net proceeds into the housing trust, that's a common tool. And then finally, for communities that have things like inclusionary zoning, there's often a fee in lieu option. So you either have to provide the units on site or you can pay a fee in lieu. And that's where a housing trust is very helpful, because that is where you put the funding. It's not, a fine or a penalty. It goes into a housing trust and is used to produce housing. But I think the first step is just to create one on paper. In Massachusetts, they're very common, and they may only have $10,000 or $20,000 in them in a small town, but you never know. And there's zero cost to actually create a special account like one.
Were you surprised at the reaction when you created Portland's? housing trust and you had that $100,000 threshold for affordable housing, if there wasn't, you know, that kind of housing part that was part of the original project plan, did you did you come up with that number knowing that people would be willing to pay for it? Because the first time I heard that, I said, you're kidding, but people pay it all the time.
Sure. So just to be fair, I didn't create the housing trust. It was there when I got there. What we did do was figure out how to capitalize it with things like this fee in lieu. There was a certain amount of money in it, but it wasn't getting funded much. I thought actually that $100,000 per unit fee in lieu is very low by national standards. I've seen fees in lieu as high as $500,000, and it really should be based on the difference in cost between a market rate unit and a permanently affordable unit, and whatever that difference is, using good methodology. 100,000 is a little low. It's actually been increased now by the Green New Deal ordinance, which is a whole nother conversation. But I actually, there's two different stages in the evolution of a city or town. Early on, when you're at a place like Portland, where you have a fairly new inclusionary zoning ordinance, I think putting fees in lieu into a housing trust is actually really beneficial, because you can leverage that $100,000 to help create 5 or 6 units by using other sources and layering them together. When you get to a place like San Francisco or Boston, you don't actually want fees in lieu. You want the actual units. You have maybe too much money in your housing trust and not enough units. So not that Portland has enough units, but it's at a different stage in that process. And I think I actually was really pretty happy when people would pay a fee in lieu and give the city some resources to produce more affordable housing. But I think at some point you have enough money in your trust and you want to actually see the units.
Interesting. Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that advice, or do you think Jeff's pretty much covered the bases?
I think Jeff has covered 95% of it. I'll just say I learned just recently that an acceptable use of a TIF zone is to create an affordable housing trust fund. I don't know if that's new and that's why I just learned it, or if it's always been that way and I just learned it. But I would encourage all municipalities to take a look at that, and I encourage them to implement that as part of their TIF policy.
Interesting. Thank you. Strawberry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dana.
I might just add that, getting back to the sort of the idea of having trust funds, it kind of gives the community something to rally around. You know, they have to come together and figure out what to do with that money. And it's just, that discussion is very healthy, and it's, you know, kind of exciting for communities to decide, okay, we want to invest in this, so we want to invest in this. And they take great pride and ownership in whatever they do invest in. So I just think it's a very healthy thing for a community to be doing, is, you know, having those rich discussions on how are we going to tackle our housing problems using this money, no matter how small it is. I think it's just wonderful to have those discussions.
Great, thank you. How about another question in the queue, Strawberry?
Sure. A question from Rosanna. How can we make funding available to community-based projects like cooperative and co-housing projects, and how to encourage this kind of grassroots efforts by simplifying approval processes?
I think simplifying approval processes would help all housing. But I think, and I'm not the expert on co-op housing, but I think the biggest hurdle right now for co-op housing in Maine is finding the right financing. But none of us here do co-op housing, so I can't speak intelligently on it. But I think there aren't many financing programs across the United States for that sort of housing. So that's where I would start, is some sort of state program to fund that kind of housing.
What is it that makes a co-op housing different? I can ask anyone that question.
I can take a stab at it. So co-op housing is when you buy into co-op housing, and I know there are people in the audience who know about co-op housing, so forgive me. When you buy into co-op housing, you're buying shares in the ownership of the property. And then you pay like a monthly fee, kind of like rent, to live there. And then when you decide to leave, you sell your shares and you have equity. So traditional financing models for that don't work.
Right. No, I understand that. Thank you. How about another question, Strawberry?
Should we be considering hiring more workers from Central America that are builders? Mid-Coast is badly short of workers in the concrete and roofing industries. We've had excellent workers from Central America. Why we can't train enough of our own for a few years, and most of our youth don't seem interested in building trades.
We were talking about that a little bit before we began our forum discussion tonight. And I don't know about specifically targeting Central America, but we were talking about the difficulty of finding people who are tradespeople and are available to do any amount of carpentry work or plumbing or electrical and so on. So, but I don't know. Do you guys have a thought? Is someone doing something innovative in trying to drive more young people into those fields?
I would just say, I think it's a great idea. Certainly, anybody from every country's, they're going to need housing themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it'd be great to have them come here and help build it, but they're going to need a place to live. And so I think we have a giant labor shortage in our state. So I think we need to welcome people from countries all over, and particularly if we can move some of them toward the construction trades, that would be absolutely wonderful, because there's a huge shortage there among many other occupations. But again, we also need to, we don't have enough housing to go around now, so we really got to get on it and make sure that we have places for them to live. So I think most of us would love to see more workers come to the state, and we really I think it should be an absolute priority that new Mainers be targeted to live in our affordable housing.
And I would just add, one policy change that might give us more workers quicker is to shorten or eliminate the waiting times for a work visa.
I think there's a lot of broad support for that. Yeah. Let's take another question.
Is rent control an effective tool for making housing affordable?
Ooh, that's a good one. What do you guys think? Jeff, you have to address that one first, because you're the MIT instructor and the planner. So.
All right, I'll make a stab at it. Rent control is a very broad term, and it can range all the way from some basic rent stabilization like the state of Oregon has, to very strict command and control on rent control, the way Cambridge, Massachusetts had until 1994, when the state of Massachusetts banned it. I think that given where we are in terms of the year-over-year increases, some form of rent stabilization would probably be helpful. I will say, however, that I think that, for example, what is in effect in the city of Portland right now is probably much more hands-on than what I'm talking about. And the downside to it is we want to produce housing, and part of the way housing gets produced in a capitalist country like the US, like it or not, is for people to get a return on their investment. And there is a question about how rent control, as applied pretty aggressively, will affect people's willingness to invest in a community. So I think there's a role for some form of rent stabilization, some basic, year-over-year increase limit. I think in Oregon it's 7%. I do worry when it gets too detailed that there are unforeseen consequences. I don't know that Portland's is at that point. It's not the most hands-on I've seen, but I worry about that. I worry about that side effect. So it's a broad tool. I think at some levels it would be really beneficial, at least at this point where we are with year-over-year increases. I worry at some point it may have the effect of protecting a small number of people or a medium number of people, but in the big picture, having an impact on our housing production, which is sort of what we're here to talk about.
I would agree with Jeff that I think some level of oversight is helpful. I guess the struggle I have is we have 400 and whatever it is, 770 communities in Maine. And so developers may decide to, build in South Portland rather than Portland or Westbrook. So developers have choices, and I think to try to have a town by town control or municipality by municipality is difficult. And so I think if there were broader controls among the state or county or a bigger area, perhaps, but the control that the group that I would like to see control, the institutional investors that are buying single family homes and renting them, and there's other groups that I guess I wish we could control more than the landlords, of which Maine's primarily a single family state, and it's really the institutional investors that I think are buying houses and renting them and preventing first-time home buyers from using them or buying them and converting them into Airbnbs. That's the group that I wish we could control a little bit more.
Is there anything in the legislation before lawmakers now that addresses the institutional investors?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, just curious. Next question, Strawberry.
Isn't there a gap in funding sources when it comes to financing workforce level rental housing, i.e. units with rents that are just above affordable housing rent levels?
I would say yes, there are a lack of programs for that income band between 61%, 61 to 120% of area median. But it's not zero, I would say. Like for instance, what we do at the Zan Company, we do mixed income housing. So we have, a portion of our project is hitting that 40 to 60% of the area median income, the low income range. And then our market rate units in the same building, although we call the market rate, they have the same fit and finish, they're not luxury, and they are priced so that people at 80 to 120 typically can afford them. Usually 80% of AMI can afford them. So we are providing housing for them, rental housing, but it's not a specific program, it's a developer choice.
I would just sort of point out that, there are about 22,000, I think, if I'm looking at this correctly, households that are cost burdened in that 60 to 80% of median in the state. There's 130,000 households and 60% or less that are cost burdened. So, I don't want us to think that, well, we've taken care of all the low income, so let's start serving the other higher income. There are, in fact, 6 times more very low income people that are cost burdened than there are in that 60 to 80 group.
How about, I think we'll have to have this question as our last question of the night. So Strawberry, of the 3 remaining questions, pick your favorite.
Ooh, they're all good ones. How can we coordinate housing, transportation, climate action, and workforce development policies? Shouldn't we try to produce the majority of new housing in village and neighborhood patterns to reduce the distance people need to travel for work and play?
Yes.
That is a succinct and good answer. How about you, Dana? Were you going to answer it too?
I'm certainly in favor of smart growth and having transportation and housing in sync. We're producing 300-400 units of affordable housing a year, and so I don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. And so Wyndham needs housing and Buxton needs housing, that there are people out there that are doubled up. So you can't, you know, there's so little versus the need that I don't want to become hyper focused on, well, we should have been one street over or a half mile down the road. I think we just need to focus on sort of more housing everywhere.
It's interesting to me to see that some of the private development like Rock Row and the Downs has that sort of connects those issues of transportation and workforce housing and appropriate development for recreational opportunities. I think that's interesting to see that those kinds of projects coming on board and to see where they might go if they become more commonplace. And I don't know, that I think it's an interesting experiment, and whether there's opportunity there to enhance affordable housing, I would think maybe so. So I don't know. Any last thought? Yeah, go ahead.
I would just add that I think if the state increased its investment in public transit and in walking and biking options for residents, that would have one part of that benefit would be more affordability, because it would reduce transportation costs for Maine residents.
Yes, and with gas, what is it? Today I paid $4.29 a gallon. Yep, that would certainly make a difference. Great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists tonight. This was a really interesting conversation. And for the folks who were watching, this was recorded and we will post it to our website as soon as the editing is finished on it. I would also encourage you to check out our website under the Policy Matters link, because we put together a resource page that has a lot of information with respect to affordable housing policy here in the state of Maine, as well as a timeline for how we got to the place we're at right now. And I realized that there were some topics we didn't get to, like affordable housing that's specifically earmarked for most vulnerable populations, but we only had an hour and a half. And so maybe at the end of this legislative session, when we see what happens with this critical mass of affordable housing bills, we can reconvene and see where we stand after that. So again, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to the audience members. Thank you, Strawberry, for running a great show for us behind the scenes. But most especially, thank you, all of our panelists, for sharing your insight and your expertise tonight. Good night.